Hey, this is Jim Ruland, author of Corporate Rock Sucks, The Rise and Fall of SST Records, which is available April 12th. You're listening to The Vinyl Guide.
Well, hey, everyone. We're brought to you today by AudiofileUSA.com. Over 42,000 used records online, all excellent and near mint condition. Don't play record Russian roulette with sellers on eBay or Discogs. Their near mint could be your VG minus. Go to AudiofileUSA.com where you can always be confident you're getting the best. Search, dig, and load up the cart with your final vinyl upgrades at AudiofileUSA.com. And we're also brought to you by the Groove Washer, the best record cleaners and protective sleeves for your vinyl collection. The Groove Washer makes your records sound their very best when you play them, and the Groove Guard record sleeves protect them when they're on the shelf. The best protection for your record collection, it's the Groove Washer, groovewasher.com, discount code VinylGuide10. And with that, on with the show. Hey everyone, it's Nate. Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Vinyl Guide. It's a rough week for humanity in general. Taylor Hawkins is no longer with us. There's people dying in Ukraine, and we may be on the edge of a third world war, but hopefully this podcast is an oasis in a sea of horse shit for everyone. As I said, my name is Nate. Welcome to The Vinyl Guide. I speak to my heroes here about music, records, and various nerdery, and today I reckon we hit all of those categories and more. Author Jim Ruland is with us, and we are going to talk SST Records and his new book, Corporate Rock Sucks, The Rise and Fall of SST Records, out shortly, and it is absolutely fantastic. I've had my mitts on a copy of this book in recent weeks. I can't say enough great things about it. Jim is fast becoming one of my favorite authors, having written My Damage with Keith Morris, Do What You Want with Bad Religion, and I reckon this book on SST fits phenomenally well into the bookshelves of the music and punk rock record nerds. And now, I quickly got to tell you about a killer bonus event for people who pre-order this book. Here's the deal. Pre-order a copy of Corporate Rock Sucks, and you can get the first chapter as well as take part in a live Q&A session with Jim and Keith Morris from Black Flag, Circle Jerks, and Off. Yep, you could be part of the session. You can listen in, even ask some questions of your own to Jim and Keith. And that session is only for pre-orders of the Corporate Rock Sucks SST book. Order one up and head over to jimruland.com to claim your goodies. Now today we talked to Jim all about SST, the history, the legacy, the rise, the downfall, the anecdotes, passing on the chance to sign Nirvana, the status of the master tapes, SST promotional vinyl and inserts, and a whole lot more. Again, today is but a taste of what's in store when you get the book. Pre-order it now and get the full story. And one last thing, if you like this interview, there's lots more episodes with various artists with connections to SST, including episodes 307 and 308 with Joe Carducci, episode 304 with Kira Rossler, formerly of Black Flag, episode 233 with Mike Watt of Minutemen, episode 219 with Matt Cameron of Soundgarden and Pearl Jam, episode 196 with Spot the Engineer, episode 145 with Chuck Dukowski, episode 118 with Billy Stevenson of Black Flag and Descendants and All, episode 100 with the mighty Henry Rollins, and the legend himself, Keith Morris, episodes 56, 165, and 290. You can hear all these right now. Subscribe to the Vinyl Guide podcast in your podcast app. Scroll, listen, and enjoy. Alrighty, with the upfronts done, let's get into our conversation with Jim Ruland and find out what happened to SST Records. Jim, thank you for coming on the Vinyl Guide.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
It is so rife for a book on SST Records. I want to start at the end, though. The very final sentence of the book. Do you know that sentence by heart?
I don't.
You don't?
This is kind of fun.
Okay. Because when I read it over and over, and I thought, you know what? This is a sentence that I bet Jim spent quite a bit of time on because it kind of summarizes everything. The final sentence of the book. When it comes to the end of SST, which Ginn will emerge? The bitter entrepreneur who uses the courts like a weapon, or the visionary musician who nurtured the dreams of so many artists and changed the course of rock and roll? That's the final sentence of the book. And it seems to me like a dare. You know, you're essentially goading him out. You've thrown down the gauntlet to finally get Greg to emerge with some sort of benevolence on the history of SST.
I would disagree with the characterization, but it definitely, it's an open-ended question, right? Because I mean, it's a little cheeky to call a book The Rise and Fall of SST Records when SST Records is still here. They haven't folded up shop. You know, they're still, you can still go and buy stuff on their website, but that's about all you can do. I had a few thoughts going into this book, and so many people at the beginning of it. In fact, a close friend of mine was like, "Oh man, you're gonna have, this is like the holy grail of every Gen X, you know, record nerd. They're gonna be all over you." And I don't know if he meant that as like a good thing, but I took it as a very negative thing, because there is a lot of negativity at the heart of this story, and I really did not want to get caught up in it. You know, if I was going to spend all this time researching the label and talking about the bands, I really wanted to spend the bulk of my energy celebrating the music and the musicians. And you know, I wondered, by leaving it open-ended at the end, if people would feel like that was a little bit naive. It's like, no, of course not. Ginn is going to begin. But I wanted to end on like something like a hopeful note that, you know, the last chapter hasn't been written. You know, maybe there's some things will change. It's not too late.
In your heart of hearts, do you think anything like that would happen?
I really hope so. You know, you really can make yourself a little crazy if you try to imagine what Greg Ginn is thinking, right? Because it's an impossible thing to do. It's an impossible thing to do with anybody. You know, we all had friends who were in relationships, and you're like, what are you doing? And I think that's what a lot of SST fans have been screaming into their computer for the last 20 years. Is like, what are you doing? You know, don't you know how cool all this music that you were responsible for putting out into the world is? So, that's my hope. Okay. Is that it inspires a, you know, I hope that I'm kind of wrong about a lot of things. I hope that there's a whole new glorious chapter of SST to be written.
Well, as do we. I'm not entirely clear, and maybe you could shed some light on this, what the SST operation is even like today. Are there people beyond Greg that are working there? What do you know anything about how it operates in modern times?
Very little. I requested an interview with Greg. Obviously, he declined, and I was very surprised to get that response from him, because that's more than a lot of his former colleagues have received. People who have written him, you know, wanting to sit down and talk with him about things, and they just get no response whatsoever. So I really can't speculate on what it's like. It's from what I'm told, the actual headquarters is pretty massive, and you know, you can order things through there, you can buy things through there. Retailers do all the time. I think probably people who own and operate record stores would have the best insight into what's going on at SST and who they deal with. Okay,
but you did receive a response. Was that a fax, an email? How did it come through?
It was a telepathic message saying, you know, I'm kidding. I did get an email. And maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was, you know, a functionary who signed his name. But, you know, who knows?
Okay. So you did get a response, which, like you say, is most people send their requests and hear nothing back. I think you call it a Hollywood no.
Yeah, it's very common in Southern California, in the movie business, the music business, and that, you know, I mean, you know, there's no such thing as a bad meeting in Hollywood, right? Everybody has great meetings, and then you never hear from the people again. So,
so do you know if SST has continued to pay royalties and things like that on their recordings up to present day?
Like at this exact moment in time, you know, I do not know what is going on there. there have been enough people that have divested, gotten the rights to their music back. And, so some of the bigger names, for example, and so they no longer, have any kind of financial relationship. But no one I talked to said, "Oh yeah, we're getting checks," and it just kind of fizzled out. But for most people, they did at some point, but then at least the ones who were, fairly, selling a fair amount of records. For example, I think in the book I quote Mark Pickerel, the Screaming Trees, talking about that they were getting royalties, and then it just kind of stopped. Kim Thile of Soundgarden talks about how they had a great relationship with SST, but they were one of the label's moneymakers. And they also had management, meaning they had people whose job it was to hound the record labels and studios and do the dirty work that, most people don't like to do. I mean, like, if you got into punk rock or indie rock, or you wanted to play drums or play guitar, the reason you got into it is not so that you could be locked in some kind of endless battle with your label. It's just not fun, and it can be a little soul crushing. So I get it.
Mm-hmm. So the bands that have the means to be able to get their recordings back, I think Sonic Youth is another one that may have gotten their rights back. They were able to have a relatively trouble-free arrangement with SST, or
well,
even.
What I think happened is that they went from SST to Enigma to Geffen, and then Geffen was like, "Okay, we're gonna get this music back," and that's, in the world of music, that's kind of what it takes, is like who's got the the loudest mouthpiece, but as my chapter in Negative Land shows, that sometimes the underdog wins, or at least doesn't get destroyed.
So Greg's the 1,000-pound gorilla, Sonic Youth is the 5,000-pound gorilla, and a lot of the folks, they're the smaller gorillas. So SST really isn't looking after their interests at all.
Well, I don't like to make statements like that, because it's if you make those kinds of blanket statements, then you can get yourself into trouble, because I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I just know, what people have told me and what I've read in individual cases. So some of the people that declined to talk to me did so because they have ongoing legal entanglements with the label. And usually, this is from what I've been told, is that lots of times these disputes will end in a settlement, and part of the settlement package is that you don't talk about it.
Okay. Who did speak with you on the record for the book?
Oh, I mean, scores of people. But like some of the people, well, I don't want to say who didn't, or who, because of the legal reasons, because I don't want to,
Sure. Well, we're not saying that those people who declined you did it on that basis either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what I did is, I did not set out to write something that was, yes, I touched on every era of the label and mention every band that was on the label, and in most cases, every album. But I mostly focus on the records that had the biggest impact on the label. And some of them are surprising, like, for example, the Stains in the early days of the label's history, because the Stains, they've been practically written out of the history of Southern California punk rock, but they had a huge influence on Greg Ginn and Black Flag, for example. Another one might be Oxbow, which is a band that SST reissued, the band Serenade in Red, which had been a record that the band had put out in Europe, but never in the United States. So it was a CD reissue, but for my money, it's like the last great album that SST put out. So I thought that it was worth talking to them and finding out what their experience was like as well. So as well as all the usual bands that you would expect to hear, you know.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the biggest moneymakers for SST?
Soundgarden, Bad Brains, those, and Black Flag were some of the biggest.
Okay. Black Flag is probably the only artist out of those that you mentioned that they still have in print or for sale through SST, yeah?
No, well, it depends on which format, right? So, in terms of records, there are still plenty of records available. It's just kind of surprising which ones are not. And I think that goes to like legal disputes and things like that. For example, you can't buy a pristine reissue, or I should say you couldn't a month ago, of Double Nickels on the Dime. That may not, maybe you can today, but you couldn't, which is very strange, right? You would think that's one of the, standout albums of the label, that you would make that available in a beautiful double gatefold edition, but nope. And then you can still buy CDs. I'm not sure if you can buy tapes. I mean, there's just a lot of weird stuff that's on the at the SST Superstore, they call it. Mm-hmm. And then the Orchard took over managing the digital music, so for the streaming sites, so that when you hear various SST bands on Spotify or iTunes or things like that, that's managed through the Orchard.
Have you noticed any pattern or any artists that are specifically, their SST releases are very, very difficult to find?
Well, so I think some of the earliest ones that were not huge sellers right away because the band broke up. Mm-hmm. For example, like that Stains self-titled record I mentioned earlier, I think it's very early in the catalog. It came out and then it sat for a couple of years, and by the time it came out, the band had broken up. So that one is extremely rare. The Dicks album, the Canadian Subhumans,
Kill from the Heart.
Yeah, those are harder to find, but like also some other ones, like the Descendants started out on New Alliance, like Milo Goes to College is a New Alliance pressing, but once SST acquired New Alliance, it reissued a lot of those things, and right around that time, the Descendants released All, and then transformed into All, and some of those early records are very hard to get. Very expensive, or I should say very expensive to acquire.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if anything is missing from their digital libraries? Something that may have been erased out of the history?
Nothing's been erased. It's just only a handful of stuff was licensed. Now, I think it's may have expanded. I'm not an expert on Spotify. I've been told that anyone can upload something on Spotify, but mm-hmm. I don't know. So if that, is that something that's like YouTube where you can put anything up, but the people who own the rights will eventually come make you take it down? I don't know.
Well, I think a lot of the music is published through CeSSTone, which is controlled by Greg, as I understand.
Yes.
And so he would be the gatekeeper to say, yes, let this music on, this other music, let's not put it out. He has that potential power, as I understand.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess my question is, what kind of music is he not letting through that gate?
I don't think there's any pattern to that. I mean, when he did the original deal with Orchard, and I think it's expanded since then, it was somewhere between 80 and 100 of the titles were released, and quite a few of them were his own. But it was also some of the more popular ones.
Right. Look, I've always held Greg in very, very high regard. And I don't want to just keep painting it as negative, but it seems to be a consuming kind of part of the story of SST. What went wrong? Like how did it go from great to start this slide that remains with us now? in your, research on the book and talking to people, have you pinpointed an event or a series of events or even a time where things just started to turn wrong?
It's funny that you asked that, and I would say no. I mean, people came out and told me all kinds of stories that I doubt only a fraction of which are true, or even if they are, it's innuendo and anecdotes and the kinds of things that, like, oh, I was hanging out with Greg after a show in Simi Valley in 1998, and he said blah blah blah, like that kind of thing. But the way I structured the book is that kind of answers this question, because I think a lot of people have this assumption that Greg was like a certain kind of person, and then at some point SST lost the plot. And I don't think that's true. I think that it goes back to the first line of the book, which I do know, which is Greg Ginn was frustrated. And with Black Flag, they did not have an easy go of it, right? They were rejected by Hollywood and weren't allowed to play in its clubs. They were thought of as a bunch of scuzzy beach rats, and they had to fight just to get a toehold into the LA punk scene. They were not embraced. They were rejected. And that you can call it bitterness or that resentment or whatever, or even just fuel, spurred Ginn on to be very combative and aggressive in all of his business dealings, not just down the road. And so I show like how each chapter is broken down almost like into a boxing match, SST versus, the media, or SST versus the LAPD, or so. I mean, but even back in the early days, Ginn had feuds with fanzines. It's kind of his nature, right? Is to kind of look for people who are working against him and then just plow right through them.
I got that theme, and that sort of tenacity, I think, is important to longevity in that industry. But also then starting things that are seemingly very combative on his own, not paying artists or doing those sort of activities that is, I would classify more as bullying tactics. It seems to me that at some point there was a decision or something happened to where he decided that he needed to exercise some sort of control.
I think the frustration that he felt at the beginning only got larger. And one of the things that was when something really bothered him, it really got under his skin. And I think that you can see that in the decision making that he made throughout his career. I mean, it's kind of like in the game of football, right? Some players, they get the ball and they immediately run to where no one is, like the empty space on the field. Some people get the ball and they go right at the person in their path, because if you go through them, then there's nothing behind them. And I think that was more Ginn's approach, is just to steamroll over people. One of his pet peeves is that he ran a very professional operation. If you were to do like a study of the marketing plan, now there was no marketing plan, but let's say you did a case study of all the things that SST did to promote Nervous Breakdown, a single EP, the first EP that SST put out, you would come away with it extremely impressed. I mean, there were print ads. They were professionally laid out, all long before computers or anything like that. It was reviewed in zines for years after its initial release. He would send these to zines. He would run ads in those zines. I mean, just did flyers, dropped those flyers everywhere. Would go to shows, hand out. I mean, just an extraordinary amount of manpower and effort just for an EP. And that's just kind of how he was. That's how he did things. So he took it very seriously. And when he ran into things like, for example, when he had his split with Keith Morris, and you'll recall this from the book, Keith Morris did an interview in Flipside, and Keith, being Keith, ran his mouth and said all kinds of things that Ginn took offense at. But he was more mad at Flipside than he was at Keith, because Flipside could have called him up and said, "Hey, is this true?" But if you've ever been part of a zine, like, you can't chase down everything that somebody says in a punk interview to see if it's true or not. I mean, that's just not how zines operate. So Ginn would get really upset by that. He would get upset at promoters who oversold shows, because it was the promoters, when they would sell twice as many tickets as they had room for. Well, that would cause the punks to get upset, and that would lead to vandalism and fights, and that would necessitate the arrival of the police, to the point where the police just showed up for every Black Flag show. So there's a pattern to all this stuff, this lack of professionalism that he was seeing at every single level. And when SST got really big, that pattern continued when he was dealing with distributors. Distributors would kind of play the candle at both ends, and sometimes they go belly up. And when a distributor goes belly up, they usually do it. They owe you a lot of money, and they have a shitload of your records. And if you're a label, or you're putting out your own music, there's very little that you can do. You're just screwed. And so this happened over and over and over again. So I'm not saying it's okay what Ginn decided to do in terms of his business, but you can certainly see where his frustration was coming from, and how it felt like he was constantly being ripped off, run to ground, and taken advantage of.
Yeah. To me, again, just reading your book, but also kind of having some understanding historically, and the various people we've talked to on the show, Spot and Keith and Joe and all these guys, it seems that it always kind of goes back to control. He needed, and probably still continues to need, to oversee all parts of the operation so closely. And I'm not sure what that's probably rooted in. I mean, psychologists could probably talk further about it, but in the early days, just that example you said was Flipside. He was upset that he didn't have the control over what Keith said to this third party entity, and then wielded his power to be able to control that going forward.
Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? Especially when you consider, like, okay, well, if you're going to control this piece of music, you're going to, that control is going to go all the way from the beginning and to the end. But we also know that that's not how he operated, in that he gave Spot an enormous amount of freedom in the control booth, and when he was producing these bands. He gave all kinds of other people, like Vita Spatare, all kinds of freedom to not sign bands, but to produce them the way that they wanted to. I mean, yes, it was always a collaborative effort. Ginn was always involved, but he was not. He didn't have too tight a hand on what was going on. And then what I find the most fascinating is that if Ginn is such is so invested in controlling the music, well, how do we explain for, like, not being able to, not having these lavish reissues? Like, where are the master tapes, for example?
Was Spot one of the sources that you used for the book?
Yep.
Okay. He actually came on our show and he talked about having some master tapes.
Still to this day?
To this day, yeah. Well, the interview was probably 2 years ago.
Okay.
But and that was one of the questions about, you raised in your book, what's happened to the master tapes? And some of my questions, where are the plates? They used to press at Rainbow Records. Do we know if anything ever came out of there or what still exists? Besides what Spot said anecdotally, saying that he's got a box of things and he's willing to talk to someone who's got money and or an apology for him. That's all I know. Do you know of any other artifacts, tapes, plates, otherwise that may still exist?
We'll be back after these messages.
Hey everyone, let me tell you about AudiofileUSA.com. AudiofileUSA.com is a fantastic place to buy used records online. AudiofileUSA.com has a heap of inventory, like tens of thousands of records you can search through online, and they are all excellent and near mint quality. These are your final upgrades, beautiful records that you can enjoy for years to come. AudiofileUSA.com is a family-owned and operated business, and they work hard to find the absolute cleanest records in the world and make them available to you. Head up there now, AudiofileUSA.com, search and dig through their selection and find the deals. Get a box of love on its way to you now from AudiofileUSA.com. Now, I know that you know that the Groove Washer is the best record cleaner in the world, but did you know that Groove Washer now makes archival quality record sleeves too? Yep, the world's best record cleaner is now making some fantastic sleeves and record accessories for a limited time introductory offer. The Groove Washer Groove Guard record sleeves are absolutely fantastic, so head up there now and try them for yourself. Go to groovewasher.com and use discount code VINYLGUIDE10. That's the Groove Washer record cleaners, record sleeves, and other protection for your record collection. That's groovewasher.com.
Now we return to the program already in progress.
No limits.
Do you know of any other artifacts, tapes, plates, otherwise that may still exist?
I'm going to take the fifth on that because I don't want to incriminate anyone, because I heard all kinds of stories and I just had a hard time believing them all, but some of them seemed very credible in the sense that it just did not seem like there was especially when things were like when they were cranking out, 50, 60, 70 titles a year, there wasn't like really a vault. There's one person that I did not talk to that I really wish I could have is, was kind of a de facto producer there. The guy who took Joe Carducci's place after he left, but he's kind of in the wind. So when my take is, if people don't want to be found, then there's, I'm not going to seek them. I'm not going to try to hunt them down for a punk rock book. They might have bigger reasons for not wanting to.
Fair enough. So actually what you just said gives me some hope that somewhere out there are some artifacts. They're not just sweating away in some closet in Tyler, Texas.
Well, there's a couple things in that I did some research into when the Meat Puppets sued SST, and they requested master tapes for all the records that they had done together, and SST's answer was they're lost.
Where do you go from there?
Yeah, really 7 different records. They're produced over a 10-year period. They're all lost, So who knows? There are some other colorful stories that are in the book that we'll just move on.
Greg has a history of being very litigious. Was that a concern going into this project?
Oh, absolutely. But I'm very fortunate in that we did a very exhaustive legal review of the book, and it actually, I was very surprised in that we did change some things, but I had to make far more changes to My Damage than I did for this book, and the reason for that is that there's a lot more drug talk in My Damage than this one.
Were there some stories or some anecdotes in the book that were right on the edge that were a bit of more of a concern than others?
No, it's more about how things were phrased. That's really, stating things as like beliefs or thoughts rather than ironclad facts.
So the early years of SST seem to have a much more endearing legacy than the latter years. I mean, to this day, we're still talking about Black Flag and Minutemen and Husker Du, but not a lot about some of the other artists and releases of the latter years. Gone, Zoog's Riff, The Royal We. The label seems to have evolved tastes, which I assume was tracking pretty much with what Greg's interests were. And one could argue that the label lost its way and was releasing albums of limited interest. Any perspective or understanding on how the music of the latter years was considered, and even what the expectations were on the sales and potential of the music at the time?
No, if Greg thought it was worth doing, then he was like, just do it. Don't, who cares if it sells or not?
Okay.
He was not, I mean, yeah, he wanted to sell things, but it's kind of like there are some labels where they have their first record that sells for 15,000 or 30,000 copies. They're like, oh, that was great. Let's do that again. And, try to exploit that market, whatever that means. Maybe Greg had those thoughts, I mean, I'm not Greg. I don't know what he was thinking when he was making those choices, but that's not the sense that I got. And also it's like SST was a very mutable thing. I mean, it also depends on like, well, what do you mean by it changed and it was of limited interest? Like a lot of that depends on what your taste is and when you came into when you became a fan of SST. If you were there in the very beginning, then, well, you had a lot of disappointment coming because SST basically, stopped being a punk label, after Husker Du left, right? It is the things had changed by then. And but at the same time, they then would reissue all that Great Descendants stuff, which, was very much, punk. So you really can't make any definitive statements about SST was a punk label from this year to this year, and then again from this year to that. I mean, you just can't do it because right alongside that, there's St. Vitus, just super sludgy, heavy doom metal that nobody was, listening to in 1985 and 1986, right? I mean, if you turn on your TV in 1986, I mean, you're going to see all the hair metal bands on the Sunset Strip prancing around and, with in spandex, right? And not the leather and chains of St. Vitus, like, and I think that points to Ginn's contrarian streak, but guess what? That's what he was into at the time. He was like, no, I'm going to take Black Flag into a heavier, darker direction. And, I mean, it's a great example of you could say his contrarian streak, but then look what he did with his own band. I mean, he believed in it. That's what he wanted to do. That was the music he was interested in. That's where he took Black Flag. So, and then you can say the same thing a few years later with that explosion of instrumental music and, jazz influenced music, because that's where Black Flag was going as well. So I think he was, someone with, like most people, evolving taste. It's just so surprising to see it in a commercial entity, because usually when there's something that's popular, they drill down and try to do it again. But, maybe that's another part of Ginn's genius. Maybe he knew, like, there's only one Bad Brains. You can't recreate that. There's only one Negative Land. You're never going to have the success of Christianity Is Stupid with an imitator, even though he himself did kind of imitate Negative Land many years later. That, for that record to sell as many copies as it did is just this weird combination of timing and the brilliance of that record,
But then if we look at something like the rebirth, I'll call it the rebirth of Black Flag with the What The record, it sounds like the timing of that was more based on the other things that were happening with Flag or with that community. He didn't want them to have that, or he wanted to remind folks that I am Black Flag.
I think you're absolutely right there. Yes, I would agree with that. It definitely seemed like a response, especially when, for years, Ginn had been doing a lot of solo work, as you pointed out earlier, some more basically studio jams that he would turn into records with a few collaborators, some of whom weren't really even bandmates, but, paid studio musicians that had a salary, that were just there to kind of program, beats to his, his insane riffs. But he had like the band Good For You, the one with the theremin. I mean, he started playing, and he had an actual vocalist, and there were songs, there were lyrics, he put out several albums, and it seemed like that's what he was going to try to do, and Flag and was stealing all his thunder. Mm-hmm. So I think some people absolutely believe that you're right, that what was a response to everything that was going on in the world.
Can we talk a little bit about SST's relationship with radio? Because from what I understand, and from a record collecting perspective, a lot of labels have promotional copies that go out, and those are very highly collectible. SST, they had a handful. They, of course, had that Thirsty and Miserable single, but I think that was a giveaway. I think there were some Zen Arcade and Double Nickels promo 12-inch with etchings on them. But outside of those and a few 7-inches, there doesn't seem to be a lot of promotional materials or specific promotional materials from SST. Are there things or a viewpoint there that I may not be seeing correctly?
No, I think you're right. And I should probably out myself right now by saying I'm not a record collector per se. No, of course I have a record collection, but I view records the same way that I view books, and that they're machines for getting the ideas across, right? So, I can read, just like I can read a book on the screen or in a glorious hardback edition. I can listen to records, I can listen to tapes, I can listen to, digital streaming in the car, the music is the most important thing to me. But that said, and also, although I have some treasured records, I was not someone who ordered SST records from SST in the 80s and the 90s. I was just someone who was, one thing, I was in the Navy, and then I was moving around quite a bit. I didn't have a place to put all that stuff. But I know that a lot of fans became diehard fans of SST because of their loyalty through the mail order, because those catalogs would come and they'd put their $6 or $7 in the mail, and 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks later, a package from Lawndale, California would arrive in their mailbox and just blow their minds. So I know that's a very big part of the SST story. And so I kind of recreated the experience during the pandemic. I would go on Discogs and I would look through all the vinyl releases, and I got really adept at finding records, and this goes back to your question, that were designated as promo copies. Like they had the corners cut off, or they had the hole punched in it, or the mark, they had the markings. And if the Discog listing was thorough, I could see that it had inserts or even mention a catalog. And then sometimes I would just hit the jackpot and on the strangest records. I have one right here. It's Das Damen Marshmallow Conspiracy, the record that they had to recall because of a copyright infringement. But it came with so much stuff. It had press release, it had a catalog, it had a photo of the band. And so, I must have bought, dozens of these records, and with all the different, from different eras of the label, so I could read all the press releases and read the catalogs and follow along to see what was this year like for this label? What were they releasing? What were they hyping? Who was doing the hyping, and who were they hyping to? That kind of thing. And So those records became, in my mind, much more valuable in a sense. And so like I have a bunch of SWA records, for example, that were for radio stations that people have sold, or for people at magazines or things like that. So it was really cool to during the pandemic, have a new record from SST arrive every week, except it was coming from some collector or some record store or whatever. And that was one of the bright sides of the pandemic, because everybody was home.
Going through their stuff, trying to figure out how to make money.
Yeah. And I was buying them.
Yeah. SST was always good about stuffing the records full of extra stuff to read and look at while you listen to the music. And as Discogs, it's, if the record comes with inserts, you could easily, add 30% more to the price just for the SST catalog or something like that.
Yes and no. Some people were hip to that, but other people not so much. It was really good, because you never really knew, because some record sellers don't even mention what's inside.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like Christmas every day.
Okay.
I mean, it's like everything is. We got so used to doing everything by email that it was like I'd be looking out the window waiting for the postman to come by, and it was, like I said, a bright spot to the pandemic.
So let's talk about your record. Like, what records did you pull in from SST for this project? What was part of your research?
Well, like I said, I was, I wanted to get things from as many different eras as possible. I didn't just want to get records from the first, 30 releases, which would have been like the first, 4 or 5 years. It took a while for things to really gain steam. But when I was working on the Bad Religion book and faced with the daunting task of how do I become intimate with a catalog with 400 songs in it? I started with set lists, right? I downloaded a couple set lists, and then I put those set lists together on Spotify or what have you. And then that was like, okay, I can kind of see, it was a good starting point. And so I did that with SST and ordered a whole bunch of anthologies. I did, I just wrote about, for example, the Duck and Cover anthology, which is all the cover songs. There's the what was it called? Sorry, the Blasting Concept. There's 2 versions of those. So that was an interesting way to get exposed to some of the earlier stuff that I wasn't already familiar with. Anything that had that kind of a vibe was a really good way to kind of get a hold of the material. So I started there. I really wanted to own a copy of Zen Arcade, so I was able to get one of those for not too expensive. And when I say I'm not a collector, I mean I'm never going to be someone that's going to be able to tell you, what version of this I have, and oh no, here's the 6 other versions. That's just not me. I think I've heard you say on this show before that, or at least one of your guests, that how much they love reissues, and I'm in that category too, because sometimes you get more information in a reissue. There'll be an interview or liner notes that weren't included with the original, so you can get a better context of what was going on in the making of this record and things like that. And so I was always hungry for information. So if I thought, if there were liner notes, or something like that, like there are in the Blasting Concept, I do that. So, but I try to grab a record from at least all the major bands, for example, that had the big impact.
Who are some of the SST bands that may not have been successful in their first run that you think people should give a second chance to?
Das Damen is a band that, every time I listen to them, I like them more and more. And I wish I'd been able to give them more space. They seem like one of these bands that were essential to the SST experience, and that they were always on the road, and that they played with all, whenever there was a new SST band or one of the bigger names, there was Das Dahlman who could play with them or tour with them or, show them the ropes or go along with them. Just one of those real workhorse bands that they're played a little bit louder and a little bit more rock at a time when people maybe weren't ready for that, like in the 90s, late 80s and early 90s. I love the Stains. I've already mentioned them three times, but I think they're absolutely amazing. I could go on and on. The band that I always loved was Sonic Youth. That was a band I listened to in college. Negative Land is another one that I think is underappreciated. Weirdly, I think the Descendants are also a bit underappreciated, especially, there isn't a punk fan alive that doesn't know who they are and hasn't listened to Milo Goes to College. But when you look at the platform at like all these pop punk bands from Green Day onward have, and then consider the Descendants, they're definitely underrated.
I guess when it comes to some of the bands in the later part of SST, I was able to order a lot of records recently from, I think, SWA and Trotsky Ice Pick for maybe $10. So a lot of those bands that I think were underappreciated, at least certainly flew under my radar. I'm very keen to explore. So any sort of recommendations like that are always appreciated.
Sometimes it's like those bands that were only on the label for a minute, like Blind Idiot God, that they did a record with SST that is absolutely insane. I love that record.
Did you listen to majority of SST output?
Oh yeah. I listened to it all. Some of it was harder to track down than others, and some of it was only in snippets at a time. But some of it, there's a band Transition with a period that Ginn picked out of a slush pile, and I listened to them, and it sounds like a mix between Helmet and Jane's Addiction, and that's not unfair to the band, but doesn't that sound kind of rad? A band that's a mix between Helmet and Jane's Addiction, So I've listened to that album, more times than some Black Flag records that I own.
What was the hardest one to track down?
Man, that's a good question, because these days you can find just about everything, either on YouTube or on Discogs or I would have to think about that. Probably some of the more obscure things. There's one of Greg Ginn's projects, Jam Bang. I really like Jam Bang. I like it more, I think it's fair to say, than some of his other Greg Ginn solo projects. And I swear I listened to it, or maybe even watched the video. It accompanied a video, like an actual DVD. And I swear I watched it at one point, and now I can't find it. I'd like to listen to it again, but maybe it was one of my blind spots, or it got taken down or put back up. Who knows? But
in your book, you mention Mark Lanigan, God rest his soul, brought Nirvana directly to Greg in the early days, and which he turned down multiple times. Have you considered what the 90s could have been if Nirvana had released anything, Bleach or anything on SST?
Think about it, because there are many books that you can read about the Seattle scene and the music that came out of the Northwest. I really love the oral history, Everybody Loves Our Town by Mark Yarm. And I also like the Taking Punk to the Masses, which was kind of like the catalog that the museum at the Space Needle put out for that exhibit they had, with a lot of stuff about Northwest music. Both of those were just outstanding in terms of the access that they had to the musicians and the stories in there. So Sub Pop was more or less done as a record label experiment, right? The lights were going out, the checks were bouncing, they were cooked, right? And then along comes Smells Like Teen Spirit, which then turns Bleach retroactively into a double platinum album, and Sub Pop is still flourishing as a record label. I mean, SST never had anything close to a platinum or a double platinum album, which kind of boggles the mind, right? You know, I mean, when you think about it, maybe now, if you were somehow able to tally up all the sales, but I suspect that's something that we're never going to know, you know, what the real sales numbers for Black Flag, for example, are. But also consider that, you know, SST had Sonic Youth, and Sonic Youth courted SST. They wanted to be on that label. You know, they really kind of soured that relationship, right? Because, you know, Sonic Youth was a hardworking band, an intelligent band, and Sister, as amazing as that record is, you know, are on the verge of making an even more amazing record in Daydream Nation. And the members of Sonic Youth, as we know, are there. I mean, they bring people together. They're just on the ground, you know. They knew what was going on. They had a great sense of what people liked. They knew what they liked, and they were constantly experimenting. So can you imagine a world where SST puts out Daydream Nation and Bleach? I mean, we're definitely in, like, you know, an alternative future in the SST universe, right? You know,
there's got to be some fan fiction on that out there. I also like how Soundgarden was very clear. I don't know if this is kind of looking backwards, retrospective, you know, lens, but they were very clear that SST was going to be a stepping stone. That was going to bring them to a nationwide audience where they would then negotiate an even larger deal. Yeah. It seemed to be very clear. So that they were very prescriptive in their leveraging of SST for their own means.
Well, that's kind of a, you know, that makes them sound very shrewd and calculating. I mean, I agree with you. That's what happened. But another way to look at it is they turned down signing a deal with a major label and went with SST instead, gambling that offer from the majors would be there in a year or two.
Yeah.
And they gambled and they were right. But, like, you know, takes, you know, some pretty big cojones to make that risk, right? Most people would take the money, right? I think they had a good sense that, no, like, nobody knows us outside of Seattle. We're an amazing band. Let's go on the road and let people find out who we are, and then
we'll have more leverage a year from now or whenever.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, in the business sense, yeah, leverage, but also just in I mean, imagine you're, you know, Kim Thile, the guitar player, and you're kind of standing next to Chris Cornell every night. I mean, you have to feel like I'm playing with, like, Robert Plant, you know. I've got, like, the best vocalist in rock and roll is 10 feet next to me. The world needs to find out about this guy, you know, and you know, rest his soul. So you know, I feel like, yeah, it's kind of shrewd, but it's also like it was just the right move, you know. They wanted to get in the van, and they did.
As far as you know, were there ever any overages for SST to be purchased from a major label or some large entity?
Oh, I don't know, but I'm sure there had to have been, especially throughout the you know, in the 90s, when people were just throwing stupid money around. And, you know, when I did the Bad Religion book, Brett Gurewitz told me that, you know, people wanted to buy up Epitaph all the time, and he didn't. He stuck to his guns, and I think he is probably glad. I mean, of course he's glad, but, like, he just knew that was not something that he should do, no matter how tempting it might be. And I think Greg Ginn is in the same category. Even when when SST was at its peak and cranking out, more records than Warner Brothers, they did not take calls from, business managers, bands managers. They only dealt directly with bands. So, I mean, I imagine that it's always been, what I'm trying to say, I think it's always been a little frustrating trying to get in touch with Greg Ginn.
Let's say tomorrow you were given controls of SST, with or without Greg, whatever. You are now the vice president in charge of SST Legacy, with the mission to prepare SST and manage the label's legacy for the next several decades to come. What sort of things would you do to change the course of where SST is?
Wow, well, it's really interesting that you would ask, because I think now I have to act like I'm a business person and have I'm running a record label, which I wouldn't know how to do. I mean, altruistically, I'd say, well, you give the rights back to the musicians, so they have the rights to their music back. I think, if I have to run the label, then it's like, well, you just rework all of the contracts and you reach out to all the artists and you say, hey, let's work something out. Now, I don't know how much money is owed or how much money the bands think they are owed, which that might make something like that untenable, in which case I would just, give the music back, especially if it's not something that's being used. I think we discussed that only a fraction of the stuff is available streaming right now, maybe like a third of the catalog, less than a third. It might even be more like 25%. So if it's not even being used and it's just sitting there, why not give it back to the artists? I think that's the best way to ensure that the legacy of the music lives on.
So you do an inventory of the various recordings, hopefully track down as many masters as you could. Do you think that would be the first step in terms of healing the legacy of SST?
I think so. Like, let's say I'm, Greg Ginn's long lost son and I've inherited the label. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't really know anything about the label until this moment. Then I think that's probably what I would do. I would probably want to make things right. And then I would do everything in my power to negotiate with bands to put out some just amazing legacy editions of some of the records that people have been clamoring for years. Stuff with all, the photos and interviews and lost tracks and things like that. I think if there was that kind of thing going on, there wouldn't even be a need for this book. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. You've spoken to a lot of artists that I think are still pretty sore about what happened to them in the SST period. If Greg was still around in your control of this environment, do you think that it's almost like making amends? There would almost have to be the Greg Ginn apology tour to a lot of these artists before they would even consider doing that?
Yes and no. I think some people are, there's a whole range of things. People are mad at him. People are also hurt, and people are bewildered because these are people that, considered Greg a friend, people that were literally in the van with him and shared the stage with him and was in the studio with him. And also, it may surprise you to learn that there are a lot of people who have no hard feelings and think very highly. And these are more from people who appreciate the fact that Greg took a chance on them and their band when no one else would, and recognize that, if not for Greg and SST, they might not ever have put out a record. And so they, and maybe don't think they are owed money. I don't want to put words in people's mouth, but I spoke to a surprising amount of people who had no ill will towards Greg, that they were just kind of sad that things were the way they were, and wished that they could talk to him and be excited about the music that they made together.
Yeah, I guess that must be very true. I mean, certainly for myself, the headlines of the difficulties of working in that environment seem to take all the oxygen out of the stories that, for example, you just alluded to, people who are just happy to have put something out and to have been part of this in any scale of it, big or small. So,
well, SST was a very male-dominated enterprise, and it was a real brotherhood of bands. And brothers fight, and brothers don't get along, and brothers do sometimes terrible things to each other, and then find a way to make it up. And maybe I'm naive, but I like to believe that there could be reconciliation, and that there can be another chapter of SST.
As you say at the end of the book, before it's too late.
Yeah, and in terms of what will actually happen, in terms of maybe the whole catalog ends up on streaming services, and the people at SST don't have to do anything ever again except cash checks. I really don't know.
Let's say that time passes, Greg passes, SST becomes the property of his estate. At that point, it's just anyone's guess what can happen to the music.
Well, and I'm not a lawyer, but what some of the research that I uncovered and some of the things I spoke to is that for most of the contracts issued by SST, like during its peak years, the rights to that music can be renegotiated, and the artist can get the rights to the work back. I think it's like a period of 30 years or 30-something years. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's mentioned in the book. But there is recourse. Just the two obstacles are, getting everybody in the band on the same page, which is challenging, and two, money, which not a lot of people have the kind of money to get lawyers involved in something, unless it's absolutely essential. So those are big hurdles, and which is why I kind of threw out a possibility. Well, what if the fans took things into their own hands and kind of helped get behind some of these bands and helped fundraise music so they could have control of their albums and reissue them themselves? What if there was like a Kickstarter kind of enterprise where you could do this kind of thing, help fund pay towards the legal fees, and with the goal of getting reissues? Are there enough fans to do something like that for every SST band? Probably not, but some of them certainly. Many of them, hopefully.
Well, that could be like a class action suit. I don't know if that's the proper term or anything, but one lawyer represents multiple parties that essentially have pretty much the same goal. I mean, that's a scenario that could play out here. I think, I won't say easily, but a possibility.
Mm-hmm. And there are lawyers who go out there and they do the dirty work, and they find out how to do exactly what I'm talking about, so that the people who create music can get the rights to the music back. And this was happened like with many artists in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s who were screwed out of royalties for years, and lawyers worked on their behalf so they could have the rights to the music and get the royalties for a substantial cut.
Right.
The main thing is that how many number one hits were produced by SST Records? None. So the financial incentive is not there with like some of the pop songs of old, or the number one hits and greatest hits and things like that.
How do you think history is going to remember SST? And what does your book do to help shape that?
Well, it's really funny in the sense that I think people who are really diehard music fans of indie rock, fans of punk rock, I mean, they know the SST story, not in broad strokes. they can name most of the bands. But like, whenever I talk to people about this project, and people would be like, "Oh yeah, SST Records, Black Flag, or SST Records this," and then I would say, "Yeah, and also the Minutemen, the Meat Puppets, Husker Du, Sonic Youth, Bad Brains, Dinosaur Jr., Soundgarden." They'd be like, "Really? All of them?" There would always be at least one or two bands that people were surprised had come out on SST, and so I think it's like most things, even when we know a lot about something, we don't know the whole story, and so I think that's what this book will help do. Is it's certainly not comprehensive. If you're familiar with the podcast, You Don't Know Mojack.
Mm-hmm.
They
Great
go into
podcast.
Yeah, highly recommended. They go into every single SST release, and I think if you were to put all of those, and they interview people and they do extensive research, and I think if you were to put all of those interviews together, and you would end up with like an archive that was thousands of pages long, and you still haven't told the full story. So I don't make that claim to have told the full story of SST, but in broad strokes, it's all there, so you can see the highs and lows of the label and all of the amazing work that they put out. And so I think they're going to be remembered as a label that was just ahead of its time, way ahead of the game. And also like like a band like that is the trailblazer, but doesn't reap all the financial rewards, that maybe the people that follow after, kind of the same way. Mm-hmm. True visionaries. And it was really shaped by the people that they brought in. You've had Joe Carducci on your show, and he basically volunteered to come work at SST because he knew as a distributor that, like, wow, I could sell a lot more Black Flag records if there was just somebody in the office to answer the phone, but they're not, because they're on tour, again. So he's like, the light bulb went off. It's like, well, what if I'm the guy who answers the phone, and I'm the one who's spreading the news about Black Flag to all these distributors across the country? I'll bet you we could make something happen. And he was absolutely right. But where would SST be without someone like that, who was able to make that leap and then willing to put in the sweat equity to make it happen?
Jim, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've been wanting to get you on the show. I've gone through your last several books. When I heard you were doing this SST book, I was over the moon. I was like, this is the perfect guy to tell the story. And we've only hit kind of the tops of the waves here. And I'm very privileged, very honored to have been able to be one of the early recipients of this book and going through it. It's everything that was promised. It's everything I imagined. And it's a wonderful read. You've got a customer for life, whatever you put out, man.
Thank you so much. I really can't tell you how much I appreciate that.
Oh, it's fantastic. And I would encourage everyone, April 12th, the book is out. Go ahead and get your pre-orders in now. It's available in all the usual spots. What are some of the independent places that people can order the book? I hate to direct them to the big massive chains. Where would you like to see people buy the book from?
Well, you can always walk into your local bookstore, who, hopefully, if they're still around, is now open, and will be happy to take your order, or give them a call, and they can certainly do it. There's also a new organization called bookshop.org, and what they have tried to do is take over Amazon's original mission, and that is fulfill book orders and book orders only, but they also pay money back into the indie book ecosystem. So it's a really good thing for the industry. That's where I often order books through there.
Bookshop.org?
Bookshop.org.
Right? Perfect. And it's global as well, yeah?
I think I'm not 100% sure. Definitely in the United States.
Okay. All right. Well, go to bookshop.org. Corporate Rock Sucks, The Rise and Fall of SST Records. I certainly hope, as we mentioned earlier, that there is a final chapter to this story. I'd love to see that come out someday. And Jim, thank you so much for coming on the Vinyl Guide. You're welcome back anytime, man.
Oh, thank you very much.
right, well, that's Jim Ruland, everyone. He's my Hemingway, and his new book, Corporate Rock Sucks, The Rise and Fall of SST Records, is phenomenal. Pre-order now and register for your session with Jim, Keith Morris, and get the first chapter. I'll put that link in the episode page. Also, I want to encourage folks to subscribe to Jim's email blog, Message from the Underworld. Comes out about once every week or two. I read it religiously. I'll put the link to that in this episode page as well. Thanks again, Jim. You're welcome back here anytime, mate. And that's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Thanks again for tuning in. Please share these episodes on your social media. Put them on your Facebook, tweet them out on Twitter, take a screenshot and put it in Instagram. I don't know what you do with Instagram, but just, tell a friend, tell your community, help get people inside the Vinyl Guide tent. That is much appreciated. Of course, you could always leave us a positive review on iTunes. Log in there and give us 5 out of 5 or 10 out of 10 stars, whatever. Say something nice, make us blush. That is always appreciated. And we'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. So until we talk next time, get out there and buy some records, people. Cheers.